Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. The first thing I noticed was the air, dense, metallic, charged with something I couldn't name. A steady hum pulsed beneath me, threading through my bones like an electric current. My senses stirred sluggishly, like they were wading through thick water. Something was wrong. I forced my eyes open, expecting the familiar dim glow of my bedroom, the cluttered mess of clothes and old coffee cups. Instead, I found myself staring up at a ceiling so smooth it looked liquid, black as obsidian, its surface rippling with ghostly veins of blue light. The walls curved inward, giving the space an unnatural symmetry, too perfect, too controlled. The air smelled clean, sterile, but not lifeless. It carried a cold, metallic bite, like the inside of a machine. I pushed myself upright, flinching as pain lanced through my ribs. My clothes, jeans, a wrinkled t-shirt, sneakers, felt absurdly out of place in this gleaming, futuristic void. This wasn't my apartment. This wasn't even Earth. A sound. My head snapped toward it, and that's when I saw them. A cluster of figures stood at a distance, silent, watching. They were tall, easily a head or two taller than me, their frames broad and powerful beneath sleek, metallic armor that shimmered like liquid steel. The air around them felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. Their faces were obscured by smooth, featureless helmets, and yet, I felt their scrutiny like a blade against my skin. These weren't just guards. They were warriors, and I was their prisoner. The tallest among them stepped forward. Unlike the others, she wore no helmet. She didn't need one. Everything about her radiated authority, from the way she carried herself to the way the others seemed to subtly shift in response to her presence. Her face was striking. Sharp angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw. Her skin had a faint luminescence, as though it caught and reflected the ambient glow of the room. But it was her eyes that held me captive. Cold silver, luminous and unreadable, locked onto me with something between disdain and boredom. "This is a mistake," she said. Her voice was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, a blade sharpened from years of command. My throat was dry, but I forced words out anyway. "I'm glad we agree. If you could just point me toward the nearest exit." She raised a hand, and I felt it. Not a force, not a visible restraint, but something in the air itself. It grew heavier, pressing down on me, stealing the breath from my lungs. Not a weapon, not telekinesis, just her presence. "I am Commandant Zylera of the Zyon Dominion," she stated, each syllable crisp with authority. "And you are what? A scholar? A laborer? You lack the build of a soldier." I gave a humorless laugh, ignoring the way my pulse hammered against my ribs. "I lack the build of an idiot who sticks around after getting kidnapped." Something flickered across her expression, too brief to name. Amusement? No. Irritation. "You speak boldly for one so fragile. And you assume a lot for someone who just met me." A ripple of movement passed through the warriors behind her. No one spoke, but I felt the tension sharpen like a wire pulled too tight. I got the distinct impression that no one spoke to Zylera like that. If she decided to snap my neck right then and there, I doubted any of them would protest. Her silver eyes remained locked onto mine, unblinking. Then, after a beat, she exhaled through her nose, slow and measured, as though deliberately reining in whatever impulse had sparked in her. "I do not have time for this," she muttered, more to herself than to me. Then, louder, to her soldiers, "Take him to the evaluation chamber." Two warriors stepped forward in perfect unison. I took an instinctive step back. "Whoa, hold on. Evaluation for what?" Zylera didn't answer right away. She studied me, her gaze flicking over me like a scientist assessing a flawed experiment. Then, as though deciding I was barely worth the effort, she said, "For compatibility." The word landed. Heavy. I blinked. Compatibility for what? She tilted her head slightly, almost curious. "You do not know." "No, I don't know. I woke up here 5 minutes ago, and so far, all I've gotten is attitude and zero answers. So maybe, just maybe, you could start explaining why the hell I'm here." For a long moment, she just looked at me, not with curiosity, not with amusement. Just assessing. Then, finally she said it. You have been selected as my mate. I stared. The words didn't register at first. Then they did. And I laughed. Loud, incredulous, verging on hysterical. Yeah, no, that's not happening. Her expression didn't change, but something beneath it did. A flicker of something too controlled to name. Irritation, maybe. Annoyance. I agree, she said, which is why this is a mistake. Fantastic. Glad we're on the same page. So let's undo the mistake and send me home. Her jaw tightened just slightly. It is not that simple. Of course it wasn't. It never was. I wanted to argue, to demand some kind of explanation, but before I could open my mouth, the warriors moved. Their grips were like iron, locking onto my arms, dragging me forward. Zalera barely spared me a glance. You will be tested. If you survive, we will discuss your fate. If I survive, cold dread settled in my gut. This wasn't just some bureaucratic mix-up. As the warriors hauled me toward an archway lined with pulsing blue symbols, a low vibration hummed through the floor. The symbols flared, their eerie light crawling up my skin like static. The doorway opened, not with a mechanical slide, but a seamless, liquid shift like space itself was folding. The warriors didn't hesitate. Neither did the door. It swallowed me whole. The moment the chamber swallowed me, the world shattered. I plunged into darkness, my body weightless, my sense of self dissolving. Then, without warning, I fell. Not in the way gravity pulls you downward, but as if space itself collapsed around me, spitting me out of one reality and into another. I crashed onto a cold, shifting surface. The impact sent a shock through my bones, knocking the air from my lungs. The ground beneath me felt unstable, moving in subtle, mechanical shifts. I pressed a hand to it, expecting metal, but it wasn't solid in the way metal should be. Instead, thousands of tiny, shifting plates formed and reformed beneath my fingertips, seamlessly adjusting, as though the entire floor was alive. Before I could rise, a voice echoed from above. Begin assessment. The words were void of emotion, precise and toneless. I forced myself up, shaking off the lingering disorientation. The room around me was massive, an endless, sterile void stretching in all directions. The walls weren't just seamless, they curved, making it impossible to determine where the space ended. No doors, no visible exits, just cold, shifting metal and a sky of distant, pulsing light. I wasn't alone. A shape emerged from the far end of the room, tall, humanoid, but unfinished. Its body rippled like liquid mercury, shifting between solid and fluid, constantly adapting. It had no face, no features, nothing to distinguish it as anything other than a thing designed to kill. Then it moved. Not walked, moved. One moment it was standing still, the next it was surging toward me impossibly fast. I barely had time to react before its arm elongated, morphing into a blade. It came down in a blur of silver, and I threw myself sideways, the strike carving deep into the shifting panels where I'd stood moments before. The impact sent out a ripple, distorting the floor beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming fast. No weapon, no armor, no idea what the hell I was supposed to do. The voice spoke again. Survive. That seemed to be the theme of the day. The construct adjusted. Its bladed arm withdrew, reshaping into something heavier, a hammer-like weapon meant to crush instead of slice. It was learning, adapting. If I kept dodging, it would counter. If I tried to run, the shifting floor would work against me. I had to think. Fast. The floor reacted to weight. It reconfigured itself under pressure. If I could manipulate that, the construct lunged again, swinging its newly formed weapon with brutal efficiency. This time, instead of dodging back, I moved forward. It wasn't expecting that. I ducked under the swing, landing low on the shifting ground, and kicked out. The floor beneath its feet responded. The instant weight shifted, the panels rearranged, and the construct lost balance. For a fraction of a second, it faltered. That was all I needed. I grabbed a fallen shard of its own shifting metal, still alive, still reforming, and drove it into its center. The result was immediate. The construct spasmed violently, its entire form glitching between liquid and solid. A harsh, fractured noise echoed through the space, a sound that wasn't quite mechanical, wasn't quite alive. Then, like a collapsing star, it imploded, its body liquefied, sinking into the floor as if it had never been there at all. Silence. Then, the walls peeled away. Not doors, not panels sliding open. The very walls of the chamber folded outward, as if they had only existed for as long as they were needed. Beyond them, bathed in a cold, artificial glow, stood Zylera. She did not look surprised. She had expected this outcome. Or perhaps, she had expected nothing at all. Her silver eyes moved over me, not with the disdain from before, not with amusement. Calculating, measuring. "I expected you to fail," she said at last. Her voice held no triumph, no disappointment, just fact. I wiped the sweat from my brow, exhaling sharply. Sorry to disappoint. For the briefest of moments, something flickered across her expression, something I couldn't place. Then, impossibly, she smiled. It was small, barely there, but undeniable. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Come," she said. "Your trial is over. We have much to discuss." I didn't move. Not immediately. There was something in her voice, a shift, a weight to those words that hadn't been there before. Surviving had only been the beginning. Something else was coming. Something far worse. Zylera did not wait to see if I would follow. She simply expected it. She strode through the corridors of the warship with the same quiet authority she carried in battle, silver eyes focused straight ahead. The warriors stationed along the way didn't merely acknowledge her presence. They reacted to it, adjusting their stances, bowing their heads slightly. Every movement, every shift in posture spoke of deep-seated reverence. I followed, if only because there was nowhere else to go. My mind worked furiously, cycling through possibilities. What was I being led to? Another test? An execution? A debriefing where they'd politely inform me that I'd be jettisoned into space for disrupting their ancient warrior traditions? The ship was massive, its design unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just metal and machinery, it breathed. The walls pulsed faintly, shifting in subtle ways, like a living entity responding to its inhabitants. I had the unsettling feeling that at any moment, the ship itself could decide I didn't belong and simply erase me. Zylera stopped in front of another set of towering doors. They slid open the moment she neared, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The space was different from the rest of the ship. Warmer, less sterile. The lighting was softer, casting deep shadows along the walls, which were adorned with intricate, swirling patterns that moved, not like holograms, but like something alive beneath the surface. A single long table dominated the center of the room, made of something dark and polished, its surface reflecting the faint glow of the shifting designs around us. Zylera took a seat, fluid and composed, then gestured toward the chair opposite her. I hesitated. "You're not about to throw me into another fight, are you?" Her gaze flicked toward me. "Are you still afraid?" It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't mocking. It was a question, one she genuinely seemed to want an answer to. I sat. Zylera remained silent for a long moment, simply watching me, measuring, calculating. "You are not what was expected," she finally said. I exhaled, leaning back in the chair. "Yeah? Well, neither was waking up on an alien warship." She ignored the comment, tilting her head slightly. "Your kind is weaker than ours. Slower, more fragile." "Gee, thanks," I muttered. But she continued, "You survived." Her tone carried no admiration, no approval. It was simply a fact. I crossed my arms. "Maybe your perfect system isn't as perfect as you think." Her lips pressed together slightly, not in anger, but something close to amusement. "You assumed this was an error." I scoffed. "Oh sure. Happens all the time. Alien warrior gets forced into an arranged marriage, and instead of a 7-foot-tall gladiator, she gets stuck with a human. Totally normal Tuesday." Something shifted in her expression, not irritation, not offense, but a flicker of something close to recognition. "Husband," she repeated, as if testing the word. "That's what this is, isn't it?" I leaned forward slightly. Your people matched you to the strongest male they could find. Only something went wrong. And instead of one of your warriors, you got me. She didn't answer immediately. That was an answer in itself. I sighed. So, am I right? Zalera studied me for a long moment, then finally spoke. The selection is absolute. It does not err. I let out a short laugh. Yeah, well, it sure as hell doesn't feel absolute. For the first time, her posture changed. A barely noticeable tilt of her head, the slightest shift in how she regarded me. You misunderstand, she said, her voice quieter now. The selection is not a machine. That made me pause. Then what is it? Zalera glanced at the swirling patterns on the wall. It is the will of the Dominion. I frowned. Right. Super helpful. Thanks. She exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the polished table. When she spoke again, her tone was different, less rehearsed, more controlled. We are a warrior race. Our bloodlines are our legacy. Strength is not merely valued. It is law. The Dominion does not allow weakness to spread. When it is time, we are chosen. Matched. Her gaze settled on me, and there was weight in it. The bond is not of our choosing. It is not questioned. To question, it is to question the very foundation of our people. I frowned. And yet, here we are. A muscle in her jaw tightened slightly. I leaned back. This wasn't just tradition. This was law. A command ingrained so deeply that even Zalera, the most powerful warrior I had encountered, was bound by it. But it still didn't answer the most important question. All right, I said, rubbing a hand over my face. Let's say I believe you. Let's say this selection reached across the galaxy and picked me. That still doesn't explain what happens next. Zalera's expression didn't waver. You will prove yourself. The words settled in my chest like a stone. That wasn't proof back there. That was the beginning. I let out a humorless laugh. Great. What's next? A trial by fire? A battle against an entire army? Zalera didn't blink. You mock, but you are not far from the truth. My stomach twisted. She continued, unbothered by my growing unease. A warrior's bond is not simply declared. It is forged. If the selection is to be honored, you must earn your place. I shook my head. And if I don't? For the first time since I met her, something in her gaze softened. Not in kindness, not in mercy, in warning. Then you do not leave this ship. The silence that followed was suffocating. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Fantastic. So my choices are become a warrior or never see Earth again. Zalera inclined her head. Correct. I studied her, searching for any sign that she might be bluffing. There was none. In her mind, this wasn't a threat. It was simply the truth. I could fight, or I could cease to exist. A slow, bitter smile tugged at my lips. You know, if you were trying to win me over, threatening me into eternal servitude isn't the best approach. Zalera didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted. Something almost like amusement. I do not require you to be won over. Of course she didn't. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze head on. And if I say yes, what then? For the first time, she hesitated, just for a breath. Then quietly she answered, then we begin. And somehow, that sounded far less like an invitation than a sentence. The training chamber was nothing like I expected. I had braced myself for something harsh, metallic, unforgiving, an extension of the warship's cold efficiency. Instead, the space around me was alive. The walls weren't smooth, sterile panels, but something shifting, something organic. The floor beneath my feet pulsed, adjusting to my weight, and the air itself carried an energy that made my skin prickle. Zalera stood a few paces away, arms folded, her expression unreadable. This is the forge, she said. It will shape you. I frowned. Shape me how exactly? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, and, as she did, the ground responded. The once flat surface rose beneath her feet, forming a narrow, elevated platform. She stood above me now, looking down, not in condescension, but as if measuring the distance between what I was and what I needed to become. You are here because the Dominion has deemed you worthy of selection, she said, her voice steady, authoritative. But worthy is not the same as ready. I crossed my arms. And how exactly do we fix that? She extended a hand toward the center of the chamber. Instantly, the space responded. The walls darkened, and something began forming in the air. Particles gathering, coalescing, until a shape took form. A figure. At first, it was nothing but a silhouette. Then, detail by detail, it solidified. I took an involuntary step back. It was me, or close enough. The construct standing before me was my exact height, my build, but where my body was flesh and blood, this thing was crafted from the ship itself. Its skin was dark and metallic, its features an eerie mimicry of my own. But its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow voids, black and endless. I swallowed hard. I really hope this is just for intimidation. Zalera's gaze didn't waver. No, the construct moved. Fast. I barely registered the blur before it was on me. I dodged on instinct, rolling out of the way as it struck where I had stood seconds before. The impact sent a shock wave through the chamber, rippling across the ground. I scrambled to my feet, pulse hammering. Okay, so we're doing this. The construct pivoted smoothly, head tilting as if assessing me. Then it lunged again. I reacted too slowly. Its fist connected with my ribs, sending me sprawling. A sharp pain flared through my side. Not broken, probably, but it felt like I had been hit by a sledgehammer. I forced myself up. Zalera watched without expression. Not concerned, not indifferent, just observing. I glared at her. Would now be a good time to ask for pointers? She didn't answer. The construct attacked again. This time I didn't dodge. Instead, I braced myself. The moment it swung, I caught its arm, or tried to. The force of the blow sent me skidding back, but I held on, twisting my body, using its momentum against it. The construct stumbled, just slightly, but it was enough. I drove my knee into its midsection and wrenched its arm, forcing it off balance. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign that I could do more than just take a beating. Zalera finally spoke. Better. I barely had time to process that before the construct adapted. It shifted mid-motion, its limbs elongating, reinforcing. It was learning. I cursed under my breath. You got to be kidding me. Zalera stepped forward, her gaze sharp. You assumed it would fight like a human. It will not. The construct didn't wait for me to adjust. It attacked again, faster than before. I dodged left, but it anticipated me, striking before I could fully evade. Pain exploded in my shoulder. I hit the ground hard. Zalera didn't flinch. You rely too much on instinct. I groaned, pushing myself up. And what exactly should I be relying on? She descended from her platform, the floor shifting beneath her as she approached. Control. The construct stilled the moment she moved. She stopped a few feet away from me, her expression unreadable. Instinct may keep you alive, but control determines victory. I exhaled sharply. Great. How do I get that? She gestured toward the construct. Stunt. I hesitated. My body protested, pain radiating from every place I'd been hit. But I stood. Zalera nodded once. Again, the construct rushed forward. This time, I didn't just react, I watched. I saw the way its weight shifted, the way its stance betrayed its next move before it even struck. I dodged, not randomly, not on instinct, but deliberately. Zalera's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes. The construct attacked again, but this time I was ready. I countered, slipping just past its reach, using its own strength against it. It staggered. Not much, but more than before. Zalera finally spoke. Good. The construct reset, stepping back, returning to its original position. The chamber responded, the walls shifting, the air settling. I stood there, chest rising and falling, aching but still standing. Zalera regarded me for a long moment. Then, she spoke the words I hadn't expected. Tomorrow, you fight me. I stared at her. What? Her gaze was steady, unmoving. Final. You are learning, but not fast enough. I shook my head, still catching my breath. You want me to fight you? She tilted her head slightly. You do not wish to? I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, I'd love to. But let's be honest, I've got about a 0% chance of winning that fight. Zalera stepped closer. The room felt smaller with her presence. That depends. On what? A pause. Then quietly she answered, on whether you still believe you are meant to fail. The chamber was silent. I swallowed hard. She didn't wait for an answer. Zalera turned, the forge responding to her movement, shifting as she exited. I stood there for a long time after she left. Tomorrow, I was fighting her. And somehow, the thought of losing wasn't what unsettled me most. It was the thought that, for the first time, I might not. The moment I stepped into the training chamber, I knew I was about to be broken. Zalera stood at the far end, arms folded, watching me with the stillness of a predator that had already decided how the hunt would end. The space around her was waiting, the air thick with something unspoken. The ship itself seemed to sense the shift, its walls humming, the ground pulsing beneath my feet. I flexed my fingers, forcing my shoulders to relax. The ache in my ribs from the last fight hadn't fully faded, but I wasn't about to show weakness. Not to her. She tilted her head slightly. Are you ready? I doubt it, I said, rolling my neck, but let's do this anyway. A flicker of something, approval, crossed her features. Then she moved. Not rushed, not aggressive. Measured, controlled. I barely had time to process before she struck. Her attack was precise, cutting through the air with a speed that made my stomach lurch. I barely dodged, twisting at the last second, but the shockwave of her movement sent me stumbling. Zalera didn't pause. She didn't need to. I caught her next move only because she let me. A shift in weight, and suddenly her legs swept toward me. I braced myself, but it didn't matter. The impact sent me crashing to the ground, the breath knocked clean from my lungs. I lay there, gasping. Above me, she exhaled through her nose, the closest thing to disappointment I had ever heard from her. Again, she said. I gritted my teeth, pushing myself up. I knew she was stronger. I knew she was faster. The question was, what was I? This time, I didn't wait for her to move first. I lunged, aiming for her center, not to land a hit, but to force a reaction. She sidestepped effortlessly, but I was already pivoting, already adapting. I dropped low, sweeping for her legs. For a split second, I thought I had her. Then she adjusted, shifting her weight at an impossible angle, countering with a strike that clipped my shoulder. I hit the ground again, but this time I rolled with it, using the momentum to push off and spring back to my feet. A small pause. Not hesitation. Recognition. She saw it. The shift. Better. I wiped blood from my lip, straightening. Not bad, right? Zalera didn't answer. She simply stepped forward. The next exchange was faster. Harder. Every move I made, she countered. Every opening I thought I had, she saw before I did. But for the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was studying her the way she had studied me. She was testing me. I was testing her back. Then, something unexpected. A mistake. It was subtle. A fraction of a second where her stance shifted, weight distributed differently than before. It was small. So small that I almost didn't catch it. But I did. I moved before I could think, twisting into the opening. My fist shot forward, aiming for her side. And suddenly, I was on the ground again. Hard. Pain flared up my back, my vision spinning from the force of the throw. Zalera loomed over me, and for the first time, she looked surprised. Not because I had fallen, because I had nearly won that exchange. I groaned, staring up at the ceiling. I think I hate you. You do not. Her voice was as steady as ever, but there was something different now. Something I couldn't name. She extended a hand. I hesitated. Then slowly I took it. She pulled me up, her grip firm, steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Tomorrow, we begin real training." I laughed breathlessly, shaking my head. That wasn't real? Zalera studied me for a long moment before answering. "No," she said. And somehow, that single word was the most terrifying thing I had heard all day. The final test was not a battle. It was a choice. I had spent weeks training under Zalera, pushing my body beyond its limits, unlearning everything I thought I knew about fighting. The bruises had faded, but their lessons remained. Strength alone wasn't enough. Neither was speed. She had taught me control, patience, how to read an opponent before they moved. And now, standing at the heart of the Dominion's Grand Hall, with the weight of everything pressing down on me, I realized the fight had never been against my own weakness. It had been against expectation. The hall stretched into infinity, towering pillars carved with the history of 1,000 battles. Warriors lined the edges, their armor gleaming under the ethereal glow of the chamber. At the far end, seated upon a throne of dark, seamless metal, was the Arbiter, the true authority of the Dominion. His presence alone silenced the room. Zalera stood beside me, her posture rigid, unreadable. She had been distant since the last training session. Not cold, never that, but something unspoken had settled between us. Something neither of us had the words for. A voice rang through the chamber, deep and resonant. Step forward. I did. The Arbiter watched me with piercing, golden eyes. He was unlike the others, not built for war, but for judgment. You have endured our trials, he said. You have survived. But survival is not enough. I clenched my fists. I had known this was coming. The Dominion does not accept weakness, the Arbiter continued. A bond with one of our own is a contract of strength. If you're to stand beside Zalera, you must be worthy. That word again. Worthy. And yet, the Arbiter went on, his gaze never leaving mine. The selection chose you. A species unproven. A being of no remarkable power. An anomaly. I held his stare. And yet, here I am. A murmur rippled through the warriors. Zalera exhaled softly, not in frustration, something closer to approval. The Arbiter studied me for a long moment. Then, he gestured to the center of the hall. A weapon rose from the ground, a blade of obsidian metal, humming with energy. Its edge shimmered like a shifting void, swallowing the light around it. This is your final trial, the Arbiter said. The right to stand among us must be claimed in battle. The murmurs grew louder. Some of the warriors looked to Zalera, as if expecting her to object. She didn't. The Arbiter gestured, and another figure stepped forward. I felt the shift in the air before I even saw them. Tall, unyielding, familiar. Zalera. I turned to her, my pulse hammering. What? The final test, she said, her voice even, is me. The world narrowed. The weight of the moment crushed down on me, and yet deep in my chest, something clicked into place. This wasn't a betrayal. This was the only way it could ever end. I had trained under her, learned from her, fought her, and now I had to prove what I had become. I stepped toward the blade. My fingers wrapped around the hilt. It was lighter than I expected. I turned back to her, searching for something in her expression, some hint of doubt, of hesitation. There was none. And yet, there was something else. A flicker in her silver eyes. A warning. Do not hold back. The room fell silent. Then, the Arbiter's voice rang out. Begin. Zalera moved first. She always did. I barely raised my blade in time to deflect the strike. The force of it sent a shock wave through my arms, nearly knocking me off balance. She pressed forward, relentless, each strike calculated, testing me. Not overpowering. Not yet. She was waiting, measuring, and suddenly I understood. She wasn't just fighting me. She was giving me a choice. I could yield. I could refuse to fight the woman who had taught me everything. Or I could finish what we started. I clenched my jaw, adjusting my stance. No hesitation. No retreat. I attacked. This time I was faster. Sharper. The blade felt like an extension of my body, each movement deliberate. Zalera countered with ease, but I saw something shift in her expression. Acknowledgement. I was no longer just reacting. I was pushing back. Blades clashed, ringing through the chamber like thunder. The warriors watched, silent, observing every movement. And then the opening came. A mistake, hers. It was small. A shift in weight, a fraction of a second where she adjusted for a strike that never came. I saw it. I took it. I moved, too fast for her to counter. My blade came to a halt just below her throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Zalera stood frozen, her breathing steady. She looked down at the blade, then back at me. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then slowly she smiled. She stepped back, lowering her weapon. I followed, releasing the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The Arbiter rose. "The bond is forged," he declared. A single sentence. And yet, it changed everything. I had won. Not just the fight. Not just the right to stand among them. But her respect. And somehow, that mattered most of all.